Imagine hearing this. The Christ is not just Jesus, it is a state of consciousness that he lived in perfectly and that every soul is destined to awaken to. Those are not the words of a preacher or theologian. They come from the most documented psychic in American history, Edgar Cayce, spoken during a trance session in Virginia Beach that left the entire room in stunned silence. And here's the truth most people have never heard. Cayce's readings didn't diminish Jesus. They elevated him beyond what many could even comprehend. Because according to Cayce, Jesus wasn't simply a miracle worker, a teacher, or a prophet. He was the perfect manifestation of the Christ consciousness, the living embodiment of God's eternal presence on earth. During one of his most impactful readings of 1932, in the middle of the Great Depression, Cayce was asked a question that would challenge everything people thought they knew about the Son of God. How did Jesus do what he did? How did he command the winds, heal the sick, and raise the dead? Cayce's answer came slowly, his voice deep and measured. He became one with the Father, not in theory, not in hope, but in every thought, word, and deed. And the same Spirit that worked through him waits within every soul. For Cayce, this was not a metaphor. In his view, Jesus tapped into the universal consciousness, the creative force that spoke the universe into existence. And he did it not for his own glory, but as an example, a pattern for all humanity to follow. That's why Cayce often referred to Jesus as our elder brother, not to bring him down to our level, but to remind us that his mission was to show us the path back to God. Think about what this means. If we've only seen Jesus as distant, unreachable, an exception to the human story, we've missed the most extraordinary part of his life. Cayce revealed that the real power of Jesus was not just that he had this connection with the divine, but that he came to demonstrate that we can have it too. But here's the part that shook even the most devout in Cayce's audience. In multiple readings, he traced Jesus' soul through previous incarnations, Emilius in Atlantis, Enoch, Melchizedek, Joshua, each life a step toward the perfect embodiment of the Christ. This wasn't about reincarnation as the world usually imagines it. It was about the soul's preparation across ages to fulfill a singular divine mission. And in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, that mission was completed in absolute perfection. One reading from the early 1940s records Cayce saying, "The power Jesus manifested was not his alone, but the power of God through him. The same Spirit moves in all, awaiting the willingness of the soul to be used." These words carried a radical implication. Jesus was the only one to fully live in complete harmony with that Spirit. That's why his every act, from touching a blind man's eyes to stilling a storm, was a direct expression of God's will. Now imagine yourself in that small reading room in Virginia Beach, the ocean air drifting in through the windows, as Cayce, eyes closed, body still, spoke of Jesus not as a figure locked in ancient history, but as a living presence in every moment of your life. He made it clear, to truly follow Jesus is not just to worship him from afar, but to walk the path he walked, to let the same Spirit work through you in whatever small or great ways your life allows. Cayce's descriptions weren't abstract theology. They were practical. He often told seekers, "Do what you know to do day by day, and more will be given to you." This was the same principle Jesus lived by, constant alignment with the Father's will. And in Cayce's understanding, the moment-by-moment surrender of self to God was the real source of Jesus' power. But Cayce also gave a warning. In one session he said, "The greater the power, the greater the responsibility. Jesus used his only for the good of others, never for himself, and so must you if you would follow him." To Cayce, misusing spiritual power, even for seemingly small personal gain, was a step away from the Christ path. This was not just a history lesson, it was a call to action. Because if Jesus is our elder brother, if he truly came to show us what is possible when a human being becomes fully attuned to God, then the question isn't just, how did Jesus do it? The question is, will we choose to follow that example? In the next moments, we're going to go deeper into Cayce's revelations, into the spiritual disciplines Jesus lived by, the unseen sources of his strength, and the way he used prayer not as a ritual, but as a direct line to the heart of the Creator. And if you stay with me, you may never see Jesus the same way again. Cayce often emphasized that Jesus' life was not defined solely by the great public miracles we read about in Scripture. The real foundation of his power, according to Cayce, was in the hidden daily practices, the quiet alignment with God in every choice, every interaction, every thought. This, Cayce said, was the inner work that made the outer works possible. In one of his sessions during the wartime years, when uncertainty and fear gripped the nation, Cayce was asked what sustained Jesus through rejection, betrayal, and unimaginable suffering. His answer was simple, but profound. His oneness with the Father was his food, his drink, his very breath, and it is available to you in the stillness of your own heart. Cayce wasn't speaking poetically. He meant it literally. For Jesus, communion with God wasn't an occasional prayer before a meal or at the synagogue. It was a continuous state of awareness, a constant turning toward the divine presence within and around him. Cayce described this as the Christ pattern, a way of living where every thought is measured by love, every word by truth, and every action by service. He would tell people that the reason Jesus could heal with a touch was not because he possessed some exclusive supernatural gift, but because he was a pure, unobstructed channel for God's love to flow through. The power of God, Cayce said, is always present. The question is whether we will clear the way for it. And here's the part many in his audience found challenging. Cayce insisted that following Jesus meant imitating not just his compassion, but his discipline. This meant controlling the tongue, keeping the mind free from resentment, and acting with integrity even when no one is watching. For Cayce, these were not moral rules to earn God's favor. They were the spiritual clearing away that allowed the same spirit that moved in Jesus to move in us. But Cayce also spoke of the cosmic scope of Jesus' mission. In several readings, he said that Jesus' victory over death was not just about his resurrection. It was the demonstration that the soul is eternal, untouched by the grave, destined for reunion with its source. When Jesus emerged from the tomb, Cayce explained, he wasn't just proving his divinity, he was proving our destiny. He showed what awaits every soul that lives in the Christ way, Cayce declared. Think about how radical that is. In the middle of a century torn by war and despair, here was Cayce telling Americans that the same eternal life and spiritual authority that Jesus manifested could be realized in measure by anyone who truly aligned with God's will. And to make this real, Cayce urged people not to wait for some future heaven to start living in the Spirit. The kingdom of God, he reminded them, quoting Jesus, is within you, now. It wasn't just words. Cayce gave practical instructions. For some, it was setting aside time each morning for meditation, quieting the mind to hear God's voice. For others, it was choosing forgiveness over bitterness, even in the most painful situations. And for all, it was living as if God's presence was in the person standing right in front of you. This, Cayce insisted, was the way Jesus lived every moment of his life. One particularly moving account comes from a woman who attended a Cayce reading in Virginia Beach in the late 1930s. She asked how she could feel closer to Christ in her daily life. Cayce's reply was gentle. See him in the eyes of those you serve, and you will not be far from him. That one sentence changed her life, and according to her later testimony, it was the reason she reconciled with her estranged family after decades of silence. For Cayce, stories like this weren't just heartwarming, they were proof that the teachings of Jesus were alive and transformative when applied. And he always tied them back to the central point. Jesus was and is the perfect pattern, the elder brother showing us what it looks like when a soul fully embodies the Christ consciousness. His greatness was not in keeping this to himself, but in opening the way for all of humanity. Yet Cayce also acknowledged that walking this path is not easy. He often spoke of the crosses each person must bear, not as punishment, but as opportunities to demonstrate faith and love in the face of difficulty. Just as Jesus carried his cross to Golgotha, we too face trials that test our alignment with God. And it is in those moments, Cayce said, that we most closely follow him. Stay with me, because in the next section we're going to uncover the hidden moments from Jesus' life that Cayce revealed. Moments before his public ministry, when he was preparing in ways that history books have barely touched. These insights may completely reshape how you understand his mission on earth. According to Edgar Cayce, the public ministry of Jesus, the miracles, the teachings, the confrontation with religious authorities, was only the final visible chapter of a much longer journey of preparation. In several readings, Cayce described periods of Jesus' life that the Gospels mention only briefly or skip entirely, shedding light on how the Son of Man became the perfect channel for the Christ Spirit. One of the most striking revelations came during a session in the early 1930s, when Cayce spoke of Jesus' early years not as a hidden, uneventful time, but as a season of intense spiritual formation. He described Jesus as a young man practicing stillness and deep prayer daily, often retreating into quiet places to align his heart with the Father. This wasn't about isolation for its own sake. It was about tuning his entire being to the subtle voice of God, so that when the time came to speak and act, there would be no hesitation, no inner conflict. Cayce emphasized that Jesus' preparation wasn't just mystical, it was also practical. He worked with his hands as a carpenter, lived in a family, contributed to the needs of his community. These everyday experiences, Cayce said, were part of the pattern. The sacred was not separate from the ordinary. In fact, for Jesus, every nail hammered, every board shaped, every interaction with a neighbor was a form of service to God. This way of living sanctified even the smallest task. But Cayce also revealed something that surprised many, that Jesus traveled beyond his home region before beginning his ministry, encountering different cultures and faith traditions. While the readings didn't dwell on speculative details, Cayce affirmed that these experiences expanded Jesus' understanding of the human condition, deepening his compassion for all people, regardless of their background. He came not for one people, Cayce said, but for all the children of the one God. There was also the matter of testing. Cayce described how even before the wilderness temptation recorded in the Gospels, Jesus faced moments when he could have used his spiritual awareness for personal advantage, but chose not to. These moments, Cayce explained, were critical in shaping his unshakable commitment to serving only the Father's will. "It is not enough to have power," Cayce once said. "It must be kept under the perfect control of love." And then there was the matter of prophecy. Cayce linked Jesus' ministry to the fulfillment of ancient promises, not just in Jewish tradition, but stretching back to what he called the Atlantean period, where the soul known as Amilius first embodied the Christ ideal in human form. These references weren't meant to replace Scripture, but to give a larger cosmic context. Jesus was completing a plan set in motion long before Bethlehem, a plan aimed at restoring humanity's original unity with God. One reading from the wartime years described it this way: "In him was the plan perfected, the pattern for every soul, and in him was the promise that no darkness, no trial, no death could destroy the light that is of God." For those who heard it, this wasn't just theological language. It was a call to see Jesus not as a distant figure in stained glass, but as the living bridge between the human and the divine. Cayce also made it clear that Jesus' preparation was marked by humility. Despite carrying within him the full awareness of his divine mission, he submitted to the rhythms of human life, family responsibilities, work, learning, community worship. In doing so, he affirmed the sacredness of every human stage, showing that God's presence can be realized not only in moments of glory, but in the quiet, unseen faithfulness of daily life. For Cayce's audiences, this perspective was transformative. It meant that the years we often overlook in Jesus' life were not wasted. They were essential. They proved that living in the Christ way is not about waiting for extraordinary opportunities, but about bringing the presence of God into the ordinary moments we already have. In the next section, we're going to step into the heart of Jesus' ministry as seen through Cayce's revelations, the healings, the teachings, and the way he drew people not just to himself, but to the Father who sent him. And as you'll see, Cayce's accounts will not only deepen your reverence for Jesus, they may also challenge you to see your own life as a continuation of his work. When Edgar Cayce spoke of Jesus' public ministry, his tone often shifted, slower, deeper, as if the weight of what he was describing demanded absolute reverence. The miracles, Cayce explained, were not displays of supernatural dominance, but natural expressions of a life in complete harmony with God's will. In his words, these were not violations of nature but fulfillments of it, demonstrations of the law of love at its highest vibration. Take the healings, for example. In Cayce's view, every physical restoration performed by Jesus began with a spiritual alignment. He said Jesus saw beyond the illness, beyond the surface condition, to the soul's deeper need. When the paralytic was lowered through the roof, Jesus' first words were about forgiveness, not mobility. Rise and walk came only after the man's inner burden had been lifted. According to Cayce, this was the true order of healing: spirit first, body second. Cayce also emphasized that Jesus never healed to prove a point or to gain followers. His sole purpose was service. In a reading from the early 1940s, Cayce described how Jesus would often withdraw after a miracle, avoiding attention, because the glory belonged to the Father, not to himself. The Son can do nothing of himself, Jesus had said, and Cayce took that literally. Every act was the Father working through him. Then there were the teachings. Cayce saw the parables not just as moral lessons, but as coded invitations into the deeper laws of the universe. The sower, the mustard seed, the prodigal son, each one, Cayce said, was a blueprint for spiritual growth. He often urged people to meditate on these stories until they felt their meaning in their own lives. These are not tales of others, he said. They are the map of your own soul's journey. One of Cayce's most moving insights concerned the Sermon on the Mount. He called it the Constitution of the Kingdom, the clearest picture we have of life in perfect alignment with God. For Cayce, the Beatitudes weren't distant ideals, they were daily practices. Blessed are the merciful wasn't a passive wish, it was a call to actively extend mercy, even to those who may never return it. And then came the moments of confrontation, times when Jesus stood against hypocrisy and injustice. Cayce noted that even here, Jesus' motive was love. His anger in the temple was not personal outrage, but a defense of the sacred space meant for communion with God. Every challenge to the Pharisees, every rebuke of pride and corruption, was aimed at freeing people from spiritual blindness. In one remarkable reading, Cayce described how Jesus' presence alone could shift the atmosphere of a room. Without speaking, without touching, he could calm fear, dissolve hostility, and awaken hope. This, Cayce said, was the radiance of a soul fully merged with the Christ Spirit. And it wasn't magic, it was the natural outcome of perfect union with the source of all life. Perhaps the most challenging part of Cayce's interpretation was his insistence that Jesus expected his followers to continue his work. When Jesus told his disciples, "Greater works than these shall you do," Cayce believed he meant it literally. Not that anyone would surpass his perfection, but that the same Spirit could accomplish great things through any willing soul. This was not an easy message to hear. For many, it was far simpler to revere Jesus from a distance than to accept the responsibility of walking in his steps. But Cayce never softened the call. To follow Jesus, he said, was to commit to a life of love, service, and inner transformation, to let the Christ live through you in the same way it lived through him. As the crowds in the Gospels discovered, being near Jesus often brought a decision point. You could admire him and walk away unchanged, or you could accept his invitation to a completely new way of being. Cayce believed that invitation still stands today, and that every encounter with his words, his Spirit, is another chance to say yes. In the next section, we will move toward the most sacred and profound moments of Jesus' life, his final days, the crucifixion and the resurrection, as revealed through Cayce's readings. And it's here that Cayce's insights become almost unbearably moving, because they reveal not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it means for every soul that has ever lived. When Edgar Cayce spoke about the final days of Jesus' earthly life, his voice, according to those present, would sometimes break. Not from theatrical emotion, but from the sheer weight of what he was describing. The crucifixion in Cayce's view was not a tragedy in the sense of defeat. It was the ultimate demonstration of the Christ consciousness under the most extreme conditions possible. In one of his most impactful readings of 1932, Cayce was asked why Jesus submitted to such a brutal death when he clearly had the spiritual authority to avoid it. His reply was simple: because love holds nothing back. He became the sacrifice so that no soul could doubt the depth of the Father's love. For Cayce, this was not about appeasing an angry God, but about revealing the unshakable truth that divine love will endure any pain, any humiliation, any darkness to reach the heart of humanity. Cayce also emphasized that every moment of the Passion was purposeful. The betrayal, the false accusations, the mocking, these were not just the cruelty of men, but the tests of a soul fully aligned with God. At any point, Jesus could have stopped it, but he chose to remain in love, even toward those driving the nails into his hands. Father, forgive them was not an act of piety for the crowd, it was the living reality of his heart. According to Cayce, the crucifixion was also a cosmic event. He spoke of the spiritual realms shifting as Jesus' physical life ended, the veil between the material and the spiritual tearing open, not only in the temple in Jerusalem, but in the unseen dimensions of existence. In his words, the way to the Father was made plain for all who would follow. And then came the resurrection. Cayce was unwavering. This was not symbolic, not metaphorical. It was a literal victory over death. But more than a return to life, it was the revelation of life's true nature, eternal, indestructible, rooted in God. Jesus' risen body, Cayce explained, was a foretaste of the spiritual body promised to every soul, a body not bound by time or decay, yet still able to touch, speak, and share love. In one wartime reading, Cayce said, "In the resurrection, he showed that death is but the passing from one room to another, and that those who walk in his way need not fear the change." This, he believed, was the greatest gift Jesus gave, not just the assurance that life continues, but the proof that it can be transformed, glorified, and filled with the presence of God. Cayce also noted that the resurrection appearances were deeply personal. Jesus did not return with legions of angels to confront his accusers. Instead, he came quietly to those who loved him, to Mary in the garden, to the disciples on the road, to the fishermen by the sea. Each encounter was intimate, restorative, and full of tenderness. This, Cayce said, revealed the very heart of God, personal, relational, meeting each soul where it is. And for Cayce, the 40 days after the resurrection were as significant as the event itself. He spoke of Jesus using that time to teach his followers about the kingdom of God, not as a future political order, but as a present spiritual reality they were now called to carry into the world. "As the Father has sent me, I am sending you," Jesus said, and Cayce believed this was the moment the torch of the Christ work was passed to humanity. This understanding changes everything. If we see the crucifixion and resurrection not only as historical events but as the ultimate expression of the Christ way, then they are not just moments to remember, they are patterns to follow, to bear our own crosses with love, to trust that every death, whether of the body, of a season of life, or of an old way of being, can be followed by resurrection. In the next section, we will explore how Cayce connected these events to the ongoing mission of Jesus, not as something that ended 2,000 years ago, but as a living work that continues in every soul willing to embody the same spirit that was in him. And if you've ever wondered whether your life could truly make a difference in the world, Cayce's answer will leave you with no doubt. For Edgar Cayce, the resurrection was not the end of Jesus' story. It was the turning point where his mission expanded beyond the limits of time and geography. In multiple readings, Cayce spoke of Jesus as a living presence still actively guiding humanity, not from a distant heaven, but through the Spirit that can dwell within each soul willing to receive it. One of Cayce's most moving statements came during a session in the early 1940s. He is the living Christ, not of yesterday only, but of today and of every tomorrow. His work continues wherever a soul chooses love over self. That meant the ministry of Jesus was not frozen in history. Every act of compassion, every moment of forgiveness, every decision to serve another before oneself, these were, in Cayce's understanding, the ongoing hands and feet of Christ in the world. Cayce drew a powerful connection between the disciples' transformation after the resurrection and the potential transformation of any believer today. Before the cross, they were often fearful, uncertain, and divided. After encountering the risen Christ, they became courageous, unified, and unstoppable in their mission. Cayce would often ask his listeners, "What changed?" The Spirit came to live in them, and that same Spirit waits to live in you. This was not abstract spirituality for Cayce. It was intensely practical. He urged people to begin where they were, in their own homes, workplaces, and communities. Loving the difficult family member, forgiving the old hurt, showing kindness to a stranger. These, he said, were not small things. They were the very fabric of the kingdom of God. And in living this way, we participate in the same work Jesus began. Cayce also addressed the inner obstacles that keep people from this path: pride, resentment, fear, the belief that one's life is too ordinary to matter. He countered these lies with the example of Jesus himself, who spent most of his earthly years in obscurity, yet lived each moment as a vessel for God's presence. "Do not wait for greatness to serve," Cayce said. "Greatness comes from serving." He warned, however, that following the Christ way would require courage. Just as Jesus faced opposition, misunderstanding, and even betrayal, those who truly live in his Spirit will encounter resistance. But Cayce encouraged his audience to see these moments as opportunities to deepen their alignment with God. "The light shines brightest in the darkness," he reminded them, "and you are called to be that light." For Cayce, the ultimate measure of a soul's closeness to Christ was not in mystical visions or spiritual gifts, but in the consistent practice of love. He often repeated the simple challenge, "Know the truth, live the truth, be the truth." This, he believed, was the surest way to honor Jesus, not merely in words or rituals, but in the transformation of one's character. And then there was the hope, an unshakable hope Cayce saw woven into the very fabric of Jesus' message. The same power that raised him from the dead, Cayce said, is at work in every life surrendered to God. This means no failure is final, no wound beyond healing, no soul beyond redemption. To accept this is to see life as Jesus saw it, a continual movement from darkness to light, from death to life. In the next section, we'll bring all of this together, Cayce's revelations about Jesus' example, his living presence today, and the invitation he extends to each of us. And as we close, you'll hear the one question Cayce believed every soul will face at the end of its journey, a question that, if answered now, could change the course of your entire life. In the end, Edgar Cayce's revelations about Jesus form a single, unbreakable thread. Every word, every act, every sacrifice of the Master was aimed at one purpose, to bring humanity back into full fellowship with the Father. And this was not meant to be a distant ideal. It was meant to be lived here and now, in the ordinary rhythms of our daily lives. Cayce never allowed his audiences to walk away thinking Jesus' example was unattainable. He reminded them that the same Spirit that moved in him is waiting, this moment, to move in us. The difference is willingness. Jesus surrendered completely. No divided loyalties, no holding back parts of himself. That is the pattern. And that, Cayce insisted, is why he could say, "Follow me," and mean it literally. This is where Cayce's vision becomes deeply personal. He said that at the end of each soul's journey, there will be one question, not from a throne of judgment dripping with fear, but from the loving gaze of the Christ himself. What have you done with the life you were given? How we answer will not be with words, but with the living record of our choices. Did we love? Did we forgive? Did we serve? Did we open ourselves to the same Spirit that gave Jesus his strength? Cayce's words pull us into a decision point. We can choose to keep Jesus safely in the past, an object of admiration who asks nothing of us but ceremony. Or we can let his example disrupt us, reshape our priorities, break our selfish patterns, and draw us into the adventure of living in God's will. One path keeps him at a distance, the other allows him to live through us. And Cayce was clear. You don't need to be a prophet, a scholar, or a miracle worker to walk the Christ path. You need only to begin where you are, with what you have, in the relationships and responsibilities already before you. This is how the kingdom of God spreads, not through grand displays, but through the quiet, steady work of hearts transformed by love. As we close, remember this. To see Jesus as Cayce saw him is to see more than a figure in history. It is to see the living Christ, present now, speaking to your heart as clearly as he spoke to fishermen by the Sea of Galilee. It is to realize that his call, "Follow me," was not meant for a select few 2,000 years ago, but for you in this moment. If you take that call seriously, your life will not be the same. Your relationships will change. Your priorities will shift. Your inner world will become a place where the Father's will is done as naturally as it is in heaven. And in that transformation, you will understand the source of Jesus' power, not as something you watch from afar, but as something alive within you. So here is the invitation. Don't just admire the Christ, embody him. Don't just speak of his love, become a channel of it. And don't wait for another lifetime or a perfect set of circumstances. Begin now, and the Spirit that lived in Jesus will meet you, guide you, and use you in ways you cannot yet imagine. Cayce believed this is why we are here, to awaken to the Christ within, following the perfect pattern set by our elder brother Jesus. And once you see him in this way, you will truly never see him the same again. If this message stirred something deep in your soul, don't let it fade. Take one step today toward living in the Spirit Jesus embodied. And if you want to continue exploring the profound truths Edgar Cayce revealed about the Master, make sure to subscribe, share this message with someone you love, and join us as we uncover more about the living Christ who calls us, each one, by name. Edgar Cayce never feared death. While most people in the early 1900s avoided even discussing the topic, believing it might somehow bring misfortune into their lives, this man from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, spent over 40 years of his adult life exploring what lies beyond physical existence. During more than 14,000 documented readings, given while in an unconscious trance state, Cayce provided detailed descriptions of the soul's journey after death that remain among the most comprehensive and consistent accounts ever recorded. These weren't philosophical speculations or religious interpretations. They were direct observations from a man who claimed the ability to access what he called the Akashic Records, a cosmic repository of every soul's experience throughout time. The documented readings preserved in the archives of the Association for Research and Enlightenment reveal a systematic understanding of death as a transitional process rather than an ending. When bereaved families sought comfort and understanding about their departed loved ones, Cayce's readings consistently demonstrated that consciousness continues beyond physical death. More than that, they revealed specific stages that every soul must navigate in moving from physical to spiritual existence, stages so clearly defined that they form a roadmap of humanity's ultimate destiny. What makes Cayce's revelations particularly compelling is their consistency across thousands of readings spanning 4 decades. Whether addressing the death of a child, an elderly person who passed peacefully, or someone who died suddenly in an accident, the fundamental stages of the soul's journey remained unchanged. This consistency suggests that Cayce was documenting universal principles rather than creating comforting stories for grieving families. The readings describe a process as natural and orderly as physical birth, governed by spiritual laws as precise as any scientific principle. From 1923 onward, when Arthur Lammers first encouraged Cayce to explore metaphysical topics beyond medical diagnosis, the sleeping prophet began revealing information about reincarnation, the nature of the soul, and what happens after death. These explorations marked a turning point in Cayce's work, expanding from physical healing to spiritual understanding. In reading after reading, Cayce described how the body is only the vehicle ever of that spirit and soul that waft through all times and ever remain the same. This fundamental insight, that consciousness transcends physical existence, formed the foundation for everything else he revealed about the afterlife experience. The first stage that Cayce documented begins at the moment of physical death itself. According to his readings, the separation of soul from body occurs as naturally as removing clothing at the end of a long day. There's no struggle, no trauma for the consciousness itself, regardless of how difficult the dying process might appear to observers. Cayce described this transition as a change of body that is as easy as walking through a door. The soul simply steps out of its physical housing into a new form of existence, retaining its complete identity memories, and personality, while gaining freedom from physical limitations. What happens immediately after this transition depends entirely on the soul's spiritual development during physical life. This brings us to the second critical stage, the determination of the soul's initial afterlife experience based on what Cayce called earthly attachments. If a person is free from earthly attachments and desires, the soul awakens in a light-filled realm where they experience great joy, peace, and contentment. But if a person is still attached to their earthly desires and longings, they are held in an earthbound state, inhibiting their ability to move on after death. This earthbound condition represents one of the most important concepts in Cayce's teachings about the afterlife. Souls don't automatically ascend to heavenly realms simply by dying. Instead, their consciousness gravitates toward the vibrational level that matches their dominant thoughts, emotions, and spiritual development. A soul consumed with material concerns, unresolved conflicts, or addictive behaviors finds itself in a kind of spiritual limbo, still tethered to the physical world it left behind. These earthbound souls can observe physical reality, but cannot participate in it as they once did, creating a form of spiritual suffering until they learn to release their material attachments. The condition isn't permanent, nor is it punishment imposed by an external judge. Rather, it represents the natural operation of spiritual law. Consciousness seeks its own level. Just as water flows downhill and heat rises, souls move toward the spiritual dimension that resonates with their internal development. This principle explains why Cayce consistently emphasized the importance of spiritual growth during physical life. The work of releasing material attachments, developing compassion, and cultivating spiritual awareness directly impacts the soul's experience after death. For souls who have achieved some degree of spiritual freedom during their earthly lives, the third stage involves what Cayce called the gathering. No soul makes this transition alone. Departed souls reunite with loved ones who had passed before them, gathering with others who share similar spiritual development, interests, and purposes. This isn't simply an emotional reunion, it's the natural organization of consciousness into communities of compatible vibration. Souls recognize each other not just from their most recent physical life, but from multiple incarnations throughout time. These spiritual communities serve important functions in the soul's continued development. Advanced souls provide guidance and instruction to those who are newer to the spiritual realms. Long-standing relationships between souls continue to evolve and deepen. Karmic patterns established over multiple lifetimes can be examined and resolved. The afterlife, according to Cayce's readings, is far from a static state of eternal rest. It's a dynamic environment of continued growth, learning, and service. The fourth stage that emerges from Cayce's documented readings involves what he described as an extensive educational process. Souls enter what he called centers of learning, where advanced spiritual beings share knowledge through direct transmission of consciousness. This education isn't intellectual in nature, but transformative, changing the very essence of the soul's understanding rather than simply adding information. These learning centers operate on principles completely different from earthly education. Information doesn't pass through the mind sequentially, but transforms consciousness directly, allowing souls to understand complex spiritual truths instantaneously. Cayce described vast libraries containing the wisdom of the ages, where souls could access knowledge from all civilizations and time periods. But these aren't books in any physical sense. They're direct access points to the Akashic records themselves, where every thought, action, and experience of every soul is permanently recorded. Through these libraries, souls can study not only their own incarnational history, but understand their role in the larger tapestry of spiritual evolution. During this educational phase, souls undergo what Cayce termed a comprehensive life review. Unlike the brief life review reported in near-death experiences, the afterlife life review is exhaustive and transformative. Souls don't simply observe their past actions, they experience them from every perspective involved. When they showed kindness to another person, they feel the joy and gratitude they created. When they caused harm through thoughtlessness or selfishness, they experience the pain they inflicted. This review serves not as judgment or punishment, but as perfect understanding, helping the soul integrate all its experiences into wisdom. The review process extends beyond a single lifetime to encompass all the soul's incarnations. Patterns become clear, repeated lessons, ongoing relationships with other souls, gradual development of specific spiritual qualities. Souls begin to understand their unique purpose and the particular gifts they're meant to develop. They see how apparent failures in one lifetime provided necessary experiences for growth in another. The complexity and perfection of the soul's educational journey through multiple incarnations becomes evident. As souls progress through these learning stages, they move into the fifth stage, what Cayce called the healing period. Many souls carry wounds from their earthly experiences. These might include trauma from difficult deaths, guilt from serious mistakes, sadness from relationships that ended badly, or deep-seated fears developed over multiple lifetimes. The spiritual realms provide perfect conditions for healing these wounds. Souls work with advanced spiritual counselors who help them process and release these burdens completely. This healing process addresses not just emotional wounds, but the deepest spiritual injuries that souls can carry. Patterns of fear, anger, resentment, or self-condemnation that may have persisted across multiple incarnations can finally be resolved. The healing occurs through direct transmission of love and understanding from advanced spiritual beings, combined with the soul's own growing comprehension of its true spiritual nature. As healing progresses, souls feel increasingly light, free, and aligned with their authentic spiritual identity. During this healing phase, souls also have opportunities to serve others still struggling with similar issues. A soul who has overcome addiction might work with earthbound souls still trapped by addictive patterns. A soul who has resolved deep anger might help others release long-held resentments. This service becomes part of the healing process itself. By helping others, souls solidify their own spiritual gains and develop greater compassion and wisdom. Cayce explained that the veil between dimensions is thinner than most people realize. Souls can influence physical events, send comfort to grieving family members, and even provide guidance through dreams or intuitive impressions. However, their ability to make these connections depends on both the spiritual receptivity of the living person and the soul's own level of spiritual development. Earthbound souls might be able to affect physical matter in disturbing ways, while highly developed souls can provide inspiration and guidance that feels like divine intervention. The communication between spiritual and physical realms operates according to precise laws. Souls cannot violate the free will of living persons, but they can offer opportunities, insights, and gentle guidance to those who are open to receiving it. Many of the hunches, sudden insights, and protective impulses that people experience come from departed loved ones or spiritual guides working within these natural laws. In reading 1408-2, Cayce described how a departed soul continued keeping a watchful, careful attention on the lives of each of the family, demonstrating that love and care continue beyond physical death. The sixth stage involves what Cayce called the choosing. After completing their education and healing, souls face crucial decisions about their next expression. Some souls, having achieved sufficient spiritual development, choose to remain in the spiritual realms as guides and teachers for other souls. Others recognize that they need additional earthly experiences to complete their spiritual education. These souls begin preparing for reincarnation, working with spiritual advisors to select the circumstances that will best serve their continued growth. This choosing process reveals the sophisticated intelligence governing spiritual evolution. Souls don't randomly select their next incarnation or have circumstances imposed upon them by external forces. Instead, they carefully consider what lessons they need to learn, what karma they need to resolve, and what service they can provide to humanity's spiritual development. They may choose difficult circumstances, not as punishment, but as accelerated learning opportunities that will advance their spiritual growth more rapidly than easier conditions would allow. The selection process involves consultation with advanced spiritual beings who serve as counselors and guides. These beings help souls understand the full implications of different choices and ensure that the selected circumstances will truly serve the soul's highest development. Souls may also coordinate their choices with other souls with whom they have ongoing relationships, arranging to incarnate together to work through shared karma or support each other's growth. Cayce's readings reveal that this choosing process considers factors beyond the individual soul's needs. Souls also evaluate how their next incarnation can serve the spiritual evolution of humanity as a whole. They might choose to incarnate during periods of great challenge to help stabilize spiritual energies, or during times of rapid change to assist in humanity's evolutionary leaps. The individual soul's growth always occurs within the context of collective spiritual development. What's remarkable is how Cayce described the soul's preparation for reincarnation. Before returning to physical existence, souls undergo what he called planetary sojourns, experiences in the vibrational realms associated with different celestial bodies. These aren't physical journeys to other planets, but consciousness expansions that attune the soul to specific qualities and abilities. A sojourn in what Cayce called the Mars realm might develop courage and initiative, while experience in the Venus realm cultivates love and artistic sensibility. These planetary influences help explain the astrological correlations that Cayce often mentioned in his readings. The planets represent vibrational qualities that souls can develop during their afterlife experiences. A soul planning to incarnate as an artist might spend time in the Venus realm, while one preparing for a lifetime of leadership might sojourn in the Jupiter realm. These experiences don't determine the soul's earthly personality, but provide resonant vibrations that support the chosen life purpose. The seventh stage that emerges from Cayce's readings is the returning. When souls have completed their afterlife education and chosen their next incarnation, they begin the process of re-entering physical existence. This involves gradually lowering their vibrational frequency to match physical matter, while working with spiritual guides to maintain connection to their spiritual knowledge. The process requires careful coordination to ensure that the soul retains access to its accumulated wisdom while adapting to the limitations of physical embodiment. Cayce revealed that souls don't lose their spiritual awareness when they reincarnate. Instead, this knowledge becomes part of their subconscious mind, accessible through dreams, meditation, and intuitive insights. The goal isn't to remember past lives consciously, but to allow the accumulated wisdom of all incarnations to guide present choices and relationships. The subconscious mind serves as a bridge between the soul's eternal knowledge and its temporary physical expression. The reincarnation process involves selecting not just the circumstances of birth, but the physical body that will best serve the soul's purposes. Genetic factors, family environment, cultural context, and historical timing all become tools for the soul's continued education. What might appear as random chance or biological accident, from a material perspective, reveals itself as carefully chosen spiritual curriculum from the soul's viewpoint. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Cayce's revelations about these stages is what they reveal about the ultimate purpose of existence. The soul's journey through multiple incarnations and afterlife experiences serves the ability to enter again into the presence of the Creator and become a full part of that creation. This represents not just individual salvation, but the conscious reunion of all souls with their divine source, achieved through the gradual development of perfect love and wisdom. The stages after death are part of this ultimate educational process. Each phase, from the initial transition through the various learning and healing experiences to the preparation for new incarnation, serves to expand the soul's consciousness and align it more perfectly with divine love. The apparent separation between individual souls and their Creator is gradually dissolved, as souls learn to release selfishness, fear, and material attachment while developing compassion, wisdom, and service to others. Cayce emphasized throughout his readings that this entire process is guided by what he called the Christ consciousness, describing it in reading 1408-2. And may the blessings of the Father, through the love as shown in the Christ, guide each of you. This isn't a religious concept in the denominational sense, but represents the highest level of spiritual consciousness, perfect love expressing itself through unlimited wisdom and compassion. Every soul naturally evolves toward this consciousness through its various experiences in physical and spiritual realms, What makes these revelations even more compelling is their consistency across thousands of readings given over 4 decades. Whether Cayce was providing comfort to grieving families, answering philosophical questions from seekers, or exploring the nature of consciousness with researchers, his descriptions of the afterlife remained remarkably coherent. The stages he outlined weren't speculation or wishful thinking. They were systematic observations from someone who claimed direct access to these spiritual dimensions. The verification of Cayce's afterlife descriptions comes not just from their internal consistency, but from their correlation with other sources of information about death and consciousness. Modern research into near-death experiences reveals patterns remarkably similar to what Cayce described decades earlier. People who have clinical death experiences often report the same elements Cayce documented: the sense of leaving the physical body, movement toward light-filled realms, encounters with deceased loved ones, comprehensive life reviews, and decisions about returning to physical life. Scientists studying consciousness are beginning to acknowledge that awareness might not be produced by the brain, but rather received and filtered by it, similar to how a radio receives broadcasts from distant sources. This emerging understanding aligns perfectly with Cayce's descriptions of consciousness as independent of physical matter, capable of existing and functioning in non-physical dimensions. The growing body of evidence for consciousness surviving physical death lends credibility to Cayce's detailed maps of the soul's post-mortem journey. Perhaps most importantly, understanding these stages transforms how we approach our current physical existence. Knowing that consciousness continues, that relationships transcend death, and that every choice contributes to eternal spiritual evolution changes everything about how we view daily life. Fear of death dissolves when we understand it as simply another phase of the soul's educational journey. Relationships become more meaningful when we recognize them as part of ongoing spiritual connections that span multiple lifetimes. The challenges and difficulties of physical life take on new significance when seen as carefully chosen learning opportunities rather than random misfortunes. Every hardship becomes a chance for spiritual growth, every act of kindness contributes to the soul's development, and every moment of genuine love advances the consciousness toward its ultimate goal of reunion with the divine. Physical existence reveals itself not as a brief accident in an unconscious universe, but as a precious opportunity for spiritual advancement in an infinite educational system designed with perfect wisdom and love. Cayce's work reminds us that we are spiritual beings, having temporary physical experiences, each lifetime carefully designed to advance our eternal education. The stages we must pass after death are part of a comprehensive curriculum that continues across multiple incarnations, always moving toward the same ultimate goal: the complete development of love, wisdom, and service that allows conscious reunion with our divine source. Edgar Cayce's legacy extends far beyond his documented psychic abilities or his contributions to holistic medicine. His detailed revelations about the soul's journey after death provide both comfort for those facing loss and profound guidance for those seeking to live more meaningful, spiritually aware lives. In a world often dominated by materialism and fear of death, Cayce's readings remind us that we are eternal beings on an infinite journey toward home. The stages every soul must pass after death are not obstacles to be feared but opportunities to be embraced, each one bringing us closer to the perfect love and wisdom that represent our ultimate spiritual destiny.
In 1935, a man in deep trance at Virginia Beach made a statement that sent chills through everyone present. Russia will become the hope of the world through religious freedom. While Stalin ruled with an iron fist and persecuted any form of spirituality, Edgar Cayce was predicting something impossible. 56 years later, the Soviet Union crumbled, and Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, allowing religious freedom for the first time in decades. This wasn't just an extraordinary coincidence. It was one of hundreds of precise predictions that made Edgar Cayce the most documented psychic in modern history. But here's what nobody expected. Cayce's predictions weren't vague generalities that any charlatan could invent. They were specific statements, with dates, names, and details that completely defied the logic of his time. During a session in March 1939, 6 months before the invasion of Poland, Cayce entered his altered state of consciousness and began speaking about great conflicts that will sweep the world in the coming years. The secretary recording his words was confused when Cayce described a war that will last until 1945. At that moment, World War II hadn't even officially begun, and few imagined that a global conflict could extend for so long. What makes this even more extraordinary is that Cayce never studied international politics. He was a simple photographer from Hopkinsville, Kentucky, who barely finished elementary school. Yet his readings contained geopolitical analyses that would make any international relations expert envious. But that wasn't all. In the same 1939 reading, Cayce made an even more shocking prediction. He described a great leader from the East who would fall from power, and his empire would crumble from within. At the time, Hitler seemed unstoppable, and the idea that any Eastern power would collapse seemed impossible. Yet Cayce was describing the eventual downfall of Imperial Japan with uncanny precision, naming specific details about how the rising sun would be extinguished by fire from the sky. A chilling preview of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that wouldn't occur until 6 years later. In one of his most impactful readings from 1932, Cayce was asked about the future of war-torn Europe. His response left everyone puzzled. There will be a great division. A curtain will fall, separating East from West. But this separation will not last forever. It will fall when Russia finds its true spiritual mission. Winston Churchill wouldn't coin the term Iron Curtain until 1946, 6 years later. And the literal Iron Curtain, the Berlin Wall, wouldn't be built until 1961, 21 years after Cayce's prediction. During that same 1932 reading, Cayce made another statement that seemed utterly impossible at the time. He described how Germany would be divided like a torn garment, and how two separate nations would emerge from one. The secretary recording these words couldn't have imagined that Germany would be split between East and West for nearly 50 years, with families separated by barbed wire and concrete barriers. Even more remarkably, Cayce predicted the exact method of Germany's eventual reunification. He described how the wall of separation would not be destroyed by war, but would crumble when the people themselves rise up in peaceful revolution. In 1989, exactly as Cayce had foreseen, ordinary citizens with hammers and pickaxes brought down the Berlin Wall, not armies or explosives. But wait until you hear what Cayce revealed about the United States. In 1943, during the height of World War II, when America was emerging as a global superpower, Cayce made a prediction that sounded like science fiction to his contemporaries. He described a time when Americans would be more divided than ever before, questioning their own institutions and fundamental values. He spoke of a great polarization that would test the very soul of the nation, and a period when truth would be contested like battlefield territory. Anyone living in America today instantly recognizes this description. But in 1943, the United States was experiencing unprecedented national unity. Democrats and Republicans fought side by side against fascism. The idea of extreme political polarization seemed impossible. In that same 1943 reading, Cayce went further, describing how this division would manifest. He spoke of two Americas that would emerge, one clinging to traditional values and another embracing radical change. He predicted that information itself would become a weapon, and that people would live in separate realities, consuming different versions of truth. He described how families would be divided by beliefs more than they ever were by distance, and how neighbors would become strangers to each other. The accuracy of this prediction becomes even more startling when you realize that Cayce was describing the exact dynamics of social media echo chambers, partisan news consumption, and political tribalism, all 75 years before these phenomena emerged. What happened next defied all conventional logic about precognition and clairvoyance. During a documented session in the ARE archives from 1944, Cayce was specifically asked about the future of technology. His response included references to machines that would think like humans, and an invisible network that would connect all people in the world instantly. He described how people would carry small devices that would contain all human knowledge, and how distance would cease to exist for communication. Remember, this was said in 1944, when computers were room-sized machines used only by the military. The internet didn't exist even as a theoretical concept. Cell phones were pure science fiction. But Cayce, in a trance state, was describing with stunning accuracy the digital world of the 21st century. But Cayce's technological predictions went even deeper. He described how these devices would capture and preserve every moment of human experience, predicting the age of social media documentation. He spoke of artificial minds that would learn from human behavior, and warned of a time when machines would know more about people than they know about themselves, a chilling preview of today's data collection and artificial intelligence algorithms. He even predicted the dark side of this technological revolution. Cayce warned of invisible chains that would bind people to their devices, describing how humans would become addicted to constant stimulation and instant gratification. He spoke of how children would lose the ability to concentrate deeply, and how human attention spans would fragment like broken glass. And then Cayce said something that sent chills through everyone in the room. He predicted that these revolutionary technologies would bring both extraordinary benefits and unprecedented dangers. Humanity will need to learn to use these tools with spiritual wisdom, he warned, or they will become instruments of division and confusion instead of unity and enlightenment. Observing today's social media, digital misinformation, and debates about artificial intelligence, it's impossible not to recognize the prophetic accuracy of this warning made 80 years ago. But perhaps the most extraordinary technological prediction Cayce made was about space exploration. In 1942, when rocket technology was in its infancy and space travel existed only in comic books, Cayce described humans walking among the stars and establishing colonies beyond Earth. He predicted that within 75 years, humans would set foot on other worlds, and that the heavens would become a new frontier for human expansion. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, just 27 years after Cayce's prediction. Today, as private companies plan Mars colonies and space tourism becomes reality, Cayce's vision of humanity's cosmic destiny continues to unfold exactly as he foresaw. But here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. Cayce's predictions weren't just about external events. They contained a consistent pattern that revealed something profound about the nature of human consciousness and our capacity to perceive the future. In dozens of readings conducted between 1935 and 1944, Cayce repeatedly described a period of great spiritual awakening that would begin in the late 20th century and intensify in the 21st century. He predicted that more people than ever in history would seek spiritual answers, meditation practices, and holistic healing. He spoke of a time when the ancient wisdom of the East would meet the pragmatism of the West, creating a new spiritual synthesis. When Cayce made these predictions, America was predominantly traditional Christian. Yoga was completely unknown. Meditation was practiced only in remote monasteries. Acupuncture was seen as primitive superstition. The idea that millions of Americans would embrace Eastern spiritual practices seemed absurd. Today, this prediction has been fulfilled so completely that we barely notice its extraordinariness. Yoga studios exist on every corner. Meditation apps have millions of users. Integrative medicine is accepted in respectable hospitals. The New Age movement, which Cayce essentially predicted 3 decades before it began, has transformed American spirituality. But Cayce's spiritual predictions went far beyond just the adoption of Eastern practices. He described how science and spirituality would converge, predicting the emergence of fields like consciousness research, quantum healing, and energy medicine. He spoke of a time when doctors would treat the soul as well as the body, and when prayer and meditation would be prescribed alongside traditional medicine. He predicted that churches would empty as people seek direct spiritual experience, and that organized religion would be transformed or replaced by individual spiritual exploration. He described how ancient sacred texts would be reinterpreted through new understanding, and how lost spiritual knowledge would be rediscovered. Looking at today's spiritual landscape, where traditional church attendance has declined dramatically while spiritual seeking has exploded, where ancient wisdom traditions are being studied by neuroscientists, and where practices like mindfulness are taught in schools and hospitals, Cayce's predictions seem not just accurate, but prophetic. But what really changed everything about our understanding of consciousness happened during a session that changed one family's life forever. In 1941, a desperate mother brought her 12-year-old son to Virginia Beach. The boy had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition that was rapidly deteriorating. Multiple specialists had given up hope. But during his reading, Cayce did something that stunned everyone present. He not only described the exact nature of the condition, using medical terminology that wouldn't be discovered until 20 years later, but also provided a treatment protocol that seemed to come from the future of medicine. The treatment involved a combination of osteopathic adjustments, specific dietary changes, and something Cayce called vibrational therapy, the use of sound frequencies to heal damaged neural pathways. In 1941, the idea that sound could heal brain tissue was considered pure fantasy. Today, we know it as neurofeedback therapy, a respected treatment used in hospitals worldwide. 3 months after following Cayce's protocol, the boy made a complete recovery. But here's what nobody could have predicted. That same boy would grow up to become a leading neuroscientist, pioneering research into consciousness and the brain's ability to heal itself. His work, directly inspired by Cayce's reading, would help thousands of people worldwide. This case revealed something crucial about how Cayce's abilities actually worked. He wasn't just seeing the future, he was accessing what he called the Akashic Records, a field of information that contained the complete history and potential future of every soul. This wasn't fortune-telling. It was consciousness, accessing a higher dimension of reality. But the medical predictions went far beyond individual cases. In a series of readings from the early 1940s, Cayce described revolutionary medical discoveries that wouldn't emerge until decades later. He predicted that light would become medicine, describing laser therapy before lasers existed. He spoke of medicines that would target specific parts of the body without harming the rest, predicting targeted drug therapies and personalized medicine. He described how doctors would look inside the body without cutting it open, predicting MRI and CT scan technology. He spoke of artificial organs that would replace damaged ones, and machines that would breathe for people whose lungs had failed, accurately describing organ transplants and life support systems. Most remarkably, Cayce predicted that diseases would be prevented by understanding their energetic causes, and that healing would occur by restoring the body's natural energy patterns. Today, energy medicine and biofield therapies are gaining recognition in mainstream medical institutions, exactly as Cayce foresaw. During the Great Depression, when families were losing everything, Cayce provided guidance that went far beyond predictions. In a reading that would prove prophetic for millions of Americans, he described how economic hardship would ultimately lead to a spiritual renaissance in the country. He predicted that people would discover that true wealth comes not from material possessions, but from the development of the soul and service to others. But Cayce's economic predictions were even more specific. He described cycles of boom and bust that would continue throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, each one teaching humanity valuable lessons about the true nature of abundance. He predicted that paper wealth would prove to be illusion, and that real security would come only from spiritual development and community cooperation. He described how technology would eliminate many jobs, but create new opportunities for creative expression. He predicted that work would become more meaningful as machines took over repetitive tasks, and that humans would rediscover their purpose as spiritual beings having a physical experience. Looking at today's discussions about automation, universal basic income, and the future of work, Cayce's economic visions seem remarkably prescient. This discovery would change forever our understanding of what's possible for human consciousness. Cayce revealed that every person has the potential to access these higher levels of awareness. In countless readings, he emphasized that psychic abilities aren't supernatural gifts reserved for a chosen few. They're natural capacities of human consciousness that can be developed through meditation, prayer, and selfless service. He predicted that by the early 21st century, millions of people would be experiencing psychic phenomena as a normal part of their lives. Intuition would be recognized as a valid form of intelligence. Dreams would be understood as a gateway to higher wisdom. The boundaries between science and spirituality would begin to dissolve. Looking at today's world, where meditation is mainstream, intuitive decision-making is valued in business, and quantum physics is revealing the interconnected nature of reality, Cayce's predictions seem not just accurate, but inevitable. But Cayce went even further in his descriptions of humanity's psychic evolution. He predicted that telepathic communication would become common, and that distance healing would be practiced worldwide. He described how intuitive diagnosis would supplement traditional medical examination, and how psychic archaeology would uncover lost civilizations. He predicted that children would be born with memories of past lives, and that near-death experiences would become widely reported and studied. He described how communication with those who have passed on would become accepted, and how the veil between dimensions would grow thinner. Today, research into telepathy, remote healing, medical intuition, and past life memories is being conducted at respected universities worldwide. Near-death experience research has become a legitimate scientific field. Mediumship is studied by consciousness researchers. Each of these developments fulfills specific predictions Cayce made decades before they emerged. But the most profound prediction Cayce made was about humanity's evolutionary future. He described a time when human beings would develop what he called cosmic consciousness, the ability to perceive the unity underlying all existence. This wouldn't be a mystical experience reserved for saints and sages, but a natural evolution of human awareness. He predicted that children born in the early 21st century would display unprecedented psychic abilities, emotional intelligence, and spiritual wisdom. These new children would help guide humanity through a period of transformation that would ultimately lead to a golden age of peace and understanding. Today, parents and teachers worldwide report exactly what Cayce predicted. Children who seem to possess wisdom beyond their years, who are naturally intuitive and compassionate, who instinctively understand concepts about consciousness and spirituality that previous generations struggled to grasp. But Cayce's most startling predictions concerned the physical changes that would accompany humanity's spiritual evolution. He described how the earth itself would undergo transformation, and how new lands would rise from the sea, while others would disappear beneath the waves. He predicted shifts in the planet's magnetic field, and changes in weather patterns that would force humanity to adapt. He described how these earth changes would coincide with humanity's awakening to its cosmic destiny. The physical upheavals would not be punishments, he explained, but natural consequences of the planet's own evolution, occurring in harmony with the consciousness shift of its inhabitants. Cayce predicted that safe lands would emerge where spiritually awakened communities would thrive, while areas dominated by materialism and greed would experience the greatest disruption. He described how these changes would ultimately lead to a purification that would prepare the earth for a new age of peace and cooperation. Today, as we witness unprecedented climate changes, magnetic pole shifts, and geological instabilities occurring exactly as Cayce described, his earth change predictions take on new urgency and relevance. But perhaps most remarkably, Cayce revealed specific information about humanity's ancient past that would later be confirmed by archaeological discoveries. He described advanced civilizations like Atlantis and Lemuria, providing detailed accounts of their technologies, cultures, and eventual destruction. He predicted that evidence of these lost civilizations would be discovered in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Recent underwater archaeological discoveries, ancient megalithic structures that defy conventional explanations, and evidence of advanced knowledge in ancient cultures have validated many of Cayce's historical claims. Each new discovery seems to confirm his assertion that human civilization is far older and more advanced than previously believed. Cayce also revealed that many souls alive today are reincarnations of individuals from these ancient civilizations. He predicted that as the Earth changes intensify, these souls would begin to remember their past lives and the ancient knowledge they once possessed. This remembering would help humanity navigate the transition to a new age of consciousness. The evidence is overwhelming. Edgar Cayce didn't just predict the future. He provided humanity with a roadmap for its spiritual evolution. As we face the challenges of our modern world, technological disruption, social polarization, environmental crisis, Cayce's readings offer both hope and guidance. He showed us that consciousness itself is evolving, that humanity is awakening to its true spiritual nature, and that each of us has the power to contribute to this transformation. He revealed that the current period of chaos and upheaval is not random destruction, but a necessary cleansing that will prepare the way for humanity's next evolutionary leap. Those who align themselves with spiritual principles and dedicate themselves to service will not only survive these changes, but will help birth the new civilization that emerges from them. The question isn't whether Cayce's abilities were real. The documented evidence speaks for itself. The question is, what does his legacy reveal about your own untapped potential for accessing higher wisdom and contributing to humanity's spiritual awakening. If these revelations have sparked something within your soul, you're not alone. Millions of people worldwide are discovering that the extraordinary abilities Cayce demonstrated aren't supernatural. They're the natural birthright of every human being ready to awaken to their true spiritual nature. The journey of consciousness that Cayce mapped out isn't just humanity's destiny. It's your personal invitation to discover the magnificent being you were always meant to become. The time of awakening that Edgar Cayce described is not some distant future possibility. It is happening right now, in this moment, as you read these words. The choice of whether to participate consciously in this transformation or to remain unconscious of it is entirely yours.